As always, it's good to be here. It's good to see each and every one of you this morning. And it's good to worship with you and worship God together. Of course, there's always a lot of exciting things going on, especially with the group here. And those things pump me up and they get me ready and they get excited. For one, it's kind of sort of as an individual work. Next Monday, not this Monday, but next Monday, we're going to have a young adult study at the Benton's house on Monday night. That's going to be the 25th. And if you're 15 and up, that's who's going to be geared for. And we would love for you to come and study Luke with us at the Benton's house on the 25th at 7 p.m. at night. As well, with things that are coming up soon, and the elders have been working on this, we would hopefully like to have some type of Lord's Supper service. And the elders have been working on this, and they're putting this together. But maybe, hopefully, to have a day, a certain Sunday, that we just devote the entire Sunday to the Lord's Supper. We sing songs about the Lord's Supper, and we give maybe a couple of talks about the Lord's Suppers and talk about the symbols and the crucifixion. And they're working on that. And when they get that together, they'll announce that when they're ready to do that. As we keep on getting excited about all these things coming up, there's something very exciting we do every Lord's Day, every day on the first of the day of the week, just like the disciples did at the very beginning of the first century. And that is to take the Lord's Supper. And it is a weekly reminder of what He did for us. It is a weekly reminder of what He did for you and for me. So before that day comes, when we spend the whole day talking about that, I want us to go ahead and have an overview of what this is all about. And that's what I'll be going with you through this morning. And I ask, as always, that you stay engaged with me and you look at these passages with me, and we'll see what the Lord wants us to know about His table, about His supper. And what I want to do, and usually we go through this chronologically, and usually we start when Jesus institutes it on that Thursday night, the night He was betrayed. And then we go to 1 Corinthians 11 and we read about what they did wrong. And we're going to go sort of to that round. But what I want to actually do this morning is start in 1 Corinthians 11. And we're going to start there. And when Paul decides to go back and talk about the very beginning, when Jesus first used those symbols to remember Him by, we will go back with Paul to Matthew and we'll read that. And we'll bring some points and basically an overall theme for why we gather together, why we come together on the first day of the week to partake of the bread and of the cup, to remember Him. In 1 Corinthians 11, we're going to read these passages bit by bit instead of reading it all the way through first. But if we just read 17 through 22 of 1 Corinthians 11. Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you have come together not for the better, but for the worst. For the first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must be also factions among you, that those who have approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. But in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of the others, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. So what we're going to do is start this morning with a negative example. And Paul had instructed these Corinthians. He had been with them for like a year and a half. He leaves, and they starts getting these reports that there's divisions among them. And he talks about that at the very beginning of the book, and he brings it up again in chapter 11 chapters later. And he blames their divisions on the way they're treating why they come together, the way they're treating the Lord's Supper. And he's been foreshadowing about this all through the book. I think it's something on his mind. Just a chapter over in 10, he uses the Lord's Supper as an example for something else. He keeps on bringing it up like this. Apparently in Corinth, there was chaos. And it was usually chaos in their worship. And he's going to cover that in chapter 14 later on. But they were treating their worship service like chaos, and their Lord's Supper was not immune to the chaos. And what we have here is this group. They're coming together, but they're not waiting for each other. And then they start partaking of this as like in a common meal. And they're eating and they're filling their gullets. And then you have some people that are coming that don't have anything, and they're not going to get to partake because it's all gone by the time they get there, and it's just a huge mess. So he's going to clean it up. And he's going to instruct them, and he's going to tell them how to do it. Now, I think we understand that. They were doing it wrong. But first, what I want to look at is this common phrase that is used constantly through the passage we read and used through the entire Bible when talking about the Lord's Supper. In verse 18, he says, when you come together as a church. When you come together as a church. In verse 17, before that, he says, you come together not for the better, but for the worse. And then again in 20, he says, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. The thing that you're doing, I don't know what it is, but it's not the Lord's Supper. But this is why you've come together. And then you can guess what Acts 27 says. On the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. It's always talking about coming together. So when you take the Lord's Supper, what do you have to do first? You come together. And I know usually we use the phrase sometimes, I go to church. Well, I'm going to church. But in reality, that's not a true statement, is it? That's kind of an impossibility, going to church. You were just as much as part of the church this morning when you're in your pajamas in bed as you were when you were here. You don't stop becoming part of the church in that manner by leaving and coming. But what the church does do, what the local assembly does do, is they assemble together. The church comes together. And we come together and we meet in one place to do what? To partake of the Lord's table, to take the Lord's Supper. And this goes into a promise that Jesus makes in Matthew 18. In Matthew 18:20, he says, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I will be there in the midst of them. 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I will be there with you. And I want you to remember this passage, because later we're going to be talking about having communion with Christ. And this verse is very important, because we're not just taking the Lord's Supper with each other. We're taking it with Him as well. And that's the fellowship in the communion. And so we look at all these phrases and we see that Paul uses it, Matthew uses it, Jesus uses it. So what would we conclude from all this? I would conclude that this is not something that you do by yourself. Because every time it's talked about, you have to gather together, come together at the church. And you have an idea, okay, I'm going to meet with 2 or 3 or more, and I'm going to gather together, and I'm going to remember Him. I'm going to take the Lord's Supper. And this is different than anything else we do in worship. Of course, we sing here when we gather together, and we have examples of that. But I also sing by myself. You know, you can see me, and maybe if you can hear me out of my apartment, I will be singing sometimes. I really love There's Room in the Kingdom. A lot of my friends make fun of that. I'll start singing There's Room in the Kingdom all the time. I love that song. Also, and hopefully this is something that you should be doing, we pray here together as we assemble together. We have examples of that. But you should also be praying by yourself. That's something else you can do by yourself, something you should do by yourself. When we preach, sometimes even I preach to myself and I preach to a mirror. And we have Bible classes by ourselves and we study by ourselves. But one thing we don't do and what we don't see in the Bible is people taking the Lord's Supper by themselves. That's nothing we see. And people want to use a hypothetical scenario and say, well, what if you're stuck on a desert island and you're all by yourself? Well, thankfully, you are not stuck in a desert island, so I don't even have to go there. When you come together, it is to break bread. This is something that you don't do by yourself. And if you think about it, what makes us a local congregation? Maybe what's the first thing that Jesus is going to recognize us is that this group right here has a lampstand. I think it's because this group has decided to come together to remember me in the way that I told them to. Maybe that's the first thing that is recognizable to say, okay, this is a local group. This is the group that assembles together to break bread. Now, continuing on, we should talk about what the problem is. Because in verse 20, he says, when you've come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. The thing that they're doing in Corinth is not the Lord's Supper. You're doing it all wrong. In verse 22, and this may be one of my favorite phrases in here, he says, what? Because he's really upset about what he's hearing about and what they're doing. In verse 22, reading this again, what? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you, because of the way they were taken. We read 21, for in eating, this one takes his own supper ahead of the others, and one is hungry, another is drunk. He closes that argument in verse 33. If you look down there to verse 33, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order when I come. And you take those passages together, we can figure out, by only hearing the answer, not the question from the Corinth, but only hear the answer from Paul, they had turned it into a common meal. And that was maybe the focus, the main problem of this. I didn't know I already clicked that. But this is what I want to talk about. It was not a common meal. So what you have is you have people coming here, and they're just filling themselves, and they're eating it like it's lunch. And this is the way they're treating it. And Paul's saying, this never was supposed to be like that. You never should have been doing it like that. The purpose of coming together is not to fill up your stomach. It's not about nutrients. It's not about, I'm hungry, I need something to eat, I'm going to get together with some people. Also, it's not a social event. It's not something that we do, you have a feast or a celebration. This isn't that sort of type of thing. I enjoy going over to the Bowen's house for lunch. Miss Cassandra is the ultimate hostess. She will not stop putting food on my plate. I'm saying, please stop. I enjoy that. We spend time together. We eat a good meal. We do fill our stomachs to the point it hurts. And we talk and we tell stories. We enjoy that. That's not this. And he's saying that he makes that point. And he uses a lot of logic here. If you want to do that, go on. There's places for that. And he has a very Ecclesiastes perspective on all this. There's a time and place for anything, chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. There's a time and a place to go eat and enjoy each other's company. This is not that place. This is not a social event. And really, when you look at this, and we're going to get to this in just a second, it's not really about spending time with each other, even though we do come together. It's about actually a personal relationship with Jesus, even though we do it together. And we'll look at that into more detail, but it's not a common meal. When we look at this and we explain this, and something that needs to be said, and you may have already seen it because I've pressed the button, there is wisdom in the portion size that we pass out. And many Christians have spent way too long focused and worried about portion size, when in reality that's not the focus. That's never been the focus. But I do need to say this. Someone somewhere, I don't know who came up with it, but said, you know what, let's just take a little bit. And if we just take a little bit, and you just have maybe one piece of bread for 40 people in each section, and if you only have cups like this big, it removes the temptation to turn it into a meal. It's really quite impossible to turn it into a common meal if you're not really taking very much large portions. I took the Lord's Supper this morning, and hopefully, if I did what I was supposed to do, I observed it the right way. But I was not filled up. Right at this moment, I'm actually very hungry. It didn't do that. It wasn't a meal at all. So what you do is you use some wisdom here, you use those portion sizes, and you remove the temptation. Now, of course, maybe in our situation, in our culture, this isn't as much of a temptation it was maybe for them in Corinthians. When you have people, a lot of homeless people that don't eat, you can understand why this would be a temptation, that they're passing food around like this. But this removes that temptation. There's someone that needs food that's hungry in that sense. You should probably take them home with you and feed them. And that would be the biblical answer to that. Now, being that I said there's wisdom in portion size, the focus has never been about portion size. And people that are constantly so worried about portion size that they're missing the point, they're in sin. And they're not taking the way that Paul and Jesus and the other apostles taught us how to take the Lord's Supper. Get what you need and pass it on. Get what you want, remember Him, and pass it on. I'm not going to be so focused on portion size I forget. Now, people leave the portion size business, and that's a good to move on. But instead of just moving on to what we actually need to talk about, what the focus is, they throw out common courtesy. And I feel like I need to say this. The bread gets passed around, get what you need. But remember, there's people behind you that want a piece too. Okay? And it should be very, very common sense. When the cup gets passed around, it's common courtesy to drink enough of the cup that the person behind you sees the cup that you drank out of and says, clearly someone's mouth has been on this. So I'm going to get a different cup. So, of course, there's wisdom in portion size. It removes the temptation, but we still have common courtesy. We still have common sense. And the Bible never tells us to throw common sense out. But it's not a meal. This is not the focus. This has never been the focus. And when you make this the focus, you're wrong. So what is the focus? Well, Paul tells us what the focus is. And the focus starts in verse 23 of 1 Corinthians 11. Verse 23, For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. What's the point? What is the focus? It's about remembering Jesus. That's the focus. And he uses that in verse 23 to take us where? To take us back to Jesus on the night he was betrayed. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Paul all record this event. And when he says that, and of course Paul wasn't there, but he says there at the beginning that this is what the Lord has delivered to him to tell the Corinthians. He knows the story because the Lord's told him the story. But when you have them gathering together to do this, and he says that phrase on the night the Lord's betrayed, he takes us somewhere in context. And he takes us to Matthew 26. And you can be turning there while I explain the context of Matthew 26. He gives us the context. When the disciples gathered together and when Jesus said these words, they really weren't taking the Lord's Supper as we take it today. There was some big differences. For one, it was on a Thursday night. This was the night that the Lord was betrayed. And when we allude to Acts 27, I've already said it, that's when Luke says that the disciples of Christ living in the new covenant take it on the first day of the week. Actually, the day that the Lord raised from the dead, not the night that he died. As well, when you have here, these group of men that gathered together in the upper room was not to take the Lord's Supper. It was to keep the Passover feast. Because these were old covenant people living in the old law. Jesus hadn't died yet. They were still having to keep the old law. And the old law required them to keep the Passover feast. The Passover feast, and a lot of us I'm probably sure know about this, is what the Israelites kept and was really a shadow of what the Lord's Supper was going to become. You had the Israelites living in captivity in Egypt. God sends the 10 plagues, and when the 10th plague comes, he gives a warning to the Israelites that says, I'm going to kill everyone's firstborn. And this is going to be finally the wake-up reminder to Pharaoh that you need to let these slaves go because they're going home. So what he tells them to do is, I want you to get a lamb, and I want you to put the lamb's blood on the doorpost. And when you put this blood on the doorpost, when I come to take the firstborn son's life, I will pass over the houses that have been cleansed by the blood of the lamb. And he passed over. And then the Pharaoh tells them to leave so quickly that they don't have enough time to let their bread leaven. They don't have enough time for their bread to rise, so they end up with unleavened bread. So now you have Jesus sitting up here remembering the Passover with the disciples with what? Unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine, which could represent the blood of the Lamb. So he institutes it. Matthew 26. Now let's read this, and then we'll break up the symbols. Matthew 26:26. And when they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, this is my body. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you. For this is the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Take, eat. This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me. When I put this together, I'm going to be using some phrases that Paul uses that Matthew doesn't, and use some that Matthew uses that Paul doesn't. When he says, this is my body, in Corinthians, he gives us the phrase, this is my body which was broken for you. This represents my body that in just a minute, as Judas betrays him, will be broken, will be used up for you. For you. Do this in remembrance of me. He says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This cup represents the blood that will be shed for you. And just like the lamb that protected you from death in the Passover, my blood will protect you from the wrath of God, from a spiritual death. I am going to be that lamb. And if we look in Hebrews, and I'm going to say this for another day, because we can go and go into this for the next weeks about the different symbols and what they all represent. But in Hebrews 10, this is what it talks about. You can't have a new covenant unless you have a blood sacrifice. And when Jesus came and he died and he did it once and for all, he shed his blood. That's what established the new covenant. The new covenant was made because of that blood that was shed. Now, being that blood was shed, being that now we are under a new covenant, because he's going to nail the old covenant to the cross, Matthew says that Jesus said this is shed for many for the remission of sins. I come here and I take of these things. What am I supposed to remember? The body that was broken for me. The blood that was shed that I might have remission of sins. The reason why we all gather together, the reason why we gather together with different Christians, this is a group of people that are living in the new covenant. This is a group of people that have recognized that God has died for them. This is a group of people that have been saved by the grace of God. So for a weekly reminder, we get together and we remember it. We refocus about it. This is it. This is why I'm here. This is what he did for me. This is the reason where I am today, because of what he did for me. And if you think about it in many different ways, of course the big thing is the spiritual reason, but think about all the reasons, things that have happened in your life because he died for you. The way that Christianity has affected the world is because he died for you. The people, the friends you have in this life, a lot of them are because you've met them because Jesus died for you. And you gathered together with them on the first day of the week to remember it. The way I live my life, the way I hope to conduct myself, why? Because he's forgiven me of my sins, because of what he did for me. Everything that I do really comes back to this. Because of what he did for me, because he broke his body for me, because he gave his blood for me. Everything hinges on this. And what he brings up in 1 Corinthians 10 is, are you living like it? Even though we do it just once on the first day of the week, do you live the rest of the week like this? Do you drink the cup of demons and the cup of Christ? Hopefully not. But you live like you're partaking of the Lord's Supper. When you take the Lord's Supper, you sit there and you remember him. What's great about this, and the Lord has blessed us in the way he's taught us. And I think we talked about this morning in this Bible class. He has truly blessed us in the way that he teaches us. He tells us to remember him, and he gives us the symbols, but he really doesn't micromanage the way we remember him. He just wants you to remember him. And people have come up with different tactics, and you need to come up with your own. You can read a passage about Jesus, about remembering him. That may be able to help you remember him. You could ring a song out of the songbook. You can sit there and you can pray to him and talk to him. You can sit there in private meditation and remember him. As long as you're remembering him, you're doing it right. Now, what we can't do is we can't just blankly stare into space. That's not remembering him. This is an important time that your brain is not empty, but you're actually thinking about him. And of course, I'm not going to judge someone too quickly. They may be having this blank stare out the window, but they might be thinking about him. I don't know. Only you know that, and only God knows that. But I ask you to remember him when you do this, because that's what Paul asks us to do. That's what Matthew asks us to do. That's what Jesus asked you to do, to remember him. Now, what's great about this, and maybe I kind of wish it wasn't great, because if we took it after, then you would be able to impress these things. But here now, you're able to evaluate yourself, because you just took it before you knew this is what we were going to talk about in the sermon. Did you do that? When we took it just a couple of minutes ago, did you remember him? Did you take of the blood, which represents the new covenant? Did you take symbolically of the bread, the body that was broken for you for remission of sins? Did you do it? Hopefully you did. Now, if you didn't, you run the chance of taking it in an unworthy manner. And as Paul says, if you take it in an unworthy manner, you're guilty. You're guilty of it. It says in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 28, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who drinks in the unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the the Lord's body. I should have picked up in verse 27, therefore whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. And really these threats are put in here because he's trying to get you to take it this seriously. This is how serious this is. This event is, even though it's weekly, even though you do it a lot, it is this serious that you take it in a proper manner and you remember him. When you remember him and what you did for you. And at the end of Matthew, if you remember, the last verse, he gives us a promise. He gives the disciples a promise that goes on with us. He tells them in verse 29, at the end of Matthew 26, I put it up here on the screen, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So he says, I'm going to drink of this with you now. I'm going to symbolically show you the symbols. But I'm not going to take part of this again. I'm not going to have communion with you like this until the kingdom comes. Now what we know next is right after that he's going to go to the garden. He's going to pray. Judas is going to betray him. He's going to be led through this sped up trial to hopefully get him dead as soon as possible. He'll die the next morning. He'll be buried for 3 nights. And then on the 3rd day he will rise again. Give us that victory of the resurrection. He's going to come back, be with the disciples for a time, and he's going to ascend into heaven. When the disciples are going to be able to be in the Father's kingdom and have communion with him again? Well, that would be Acts chapter 2. Because in Acts chapter 2, Peter's going to open up the kingdom. People are going to be allowed to enter the kingdom of God. And what are they going to do on the first day of the week? They're going to have communion with Christ. They're going to drink of the fruit of the vine with Jesus. So yes, we take this with each other, but what's the focus? We're taking this with Jesus. So you're sitting there and you can put yourself in the mind, this may be something to meditate on. You sit at the Lord's table, you're partaking of these symbols with him. What do you do? What would you say to him? Would you say thank you? Would you say I'm sorry? Something to think about. Honestly, if I was in that situation, I don't know if I could say anything except just remember him. It's a thing to think about because when 2 or 3 are gathered together, he is here, isn't he? And when we took the Lord's Supper, guess what? He was here. He was here with us. And he had communion with us, and he had fellowship with us. And together, we thanked him for what he did for us. Because we are citizens living in the kingdom, having communion with Jesus Christ. To kind of put a couple of verses together, and we already read this in 25 and 29 of 1 Corinthians 11. Let the citizen of the Father's kingdom examine himself and proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. As members of the kingdom, we sit here, we remember him, we examine ourselves, and we proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. And in a lot of ways, even though this is the mission statement of the Lord's Supper maybe, it's a mission statement of the Christian's life. You know, what do? We examine ourselves, we have a relationship with Jesus, and we proclaim his death until he comes back. And this is what he's asked us to do, and this is what we're going to do. As always, I thank you for being engaged with me. And I thank you for being here and reading these verses with me and going over this as serious as it is together. What I don't like, and maybe it's one of those tradition things that kind of seeps in, is Sunday morning when we gather together, sometimes the sermon is put in the focal point. And sometimes maybe in our brains that's what we think. Okay, we get together and I wonder who's going to preach. Is it going to be Mr. Terry or Andrew? That's not the focus. And when we gathered together for the purpose that we did this morning, this was not the focus. Even though we've been commanded to do this, even though we have examples of this, even though we're going to do this, this wasn't the focus. The focus is what we just did. The focus was remembering him through the symbols that he gave us. Because this is what the citizens of the kingdom who are on this earth do together. We come together and we break bread. If there's anyone here this morning that either doesn't understand what God has done for you, we can study with you. If there's anything we can do to help you understand if you want to know. There's someone here that wants to be a part of the kingdom, wants to learn about that. We can study with you and we can teach you about the kingdom. There's somebody here that already knows what they need to do. And when we pass around the Lord's Supper and you don't take it with us because you can't, you're not part of the kingdom yet, and you want to make that different, and you want to have communion with Jesus, and you want to have fellowship with Him, we can do that for you this morning. We can baptize you in the waters of baptism. If there's anyone here that feels like they're taking it in an unworthy manner, and I mean mainly because they're not living the way through the rest of the week as they're living on Sunday morning, if you feel like you need the prayers of the congregation to help to repent of that, to ask for forgiveness, we also want to assist you with that this morning. If there's any of your